Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Quetzal Talk. And today we have a guest, Gaspare Genna. Thank you from UTEP. He's the head of the political science here at UTEP. So yeah, we just wanted to have you on because we have a lot of questions about El Paso and Juarez, and specifically like the America and Mexico's relation politically.
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about it.
Awesome. But before we get there, what exactly is political science? Because it seems like it has such a broad spectrum of topics to go over.
Okay, well, first, I just want to mention really briefly that we are the Department of Political Science and Public Administration here at UTEP. So what is political science? Political science, as kind of like the name indicates, is the scientific study of politics. So what we do is we use the same methodology, the science-based epistemology or the scientific method to study politics. It's the exact same method that biologists use to study organisms, that chemists use when they're studying, chemical reactions. Physicists are using to study the outer space or what have you, right? So we just use those same things. So what does that mean? That means that we don't use ideology. We don't look at it through a normative lens, right? We approach it like any other skeptical scientist, in which we have a research question, we don't have an answer, right? We're not using ideology. We're just going to be looking at a theory, develop hypotheses, test the hypotheses using data, not the convenient data, all the data, focus on quality of the data, and then come up with the conclusions that the data tells us.
Okay. And for example, what kind of problems do you, study or try to discover the answer to?
Well, there are very many. So let me just pick one that I'm currently working on, and that is, which is relevant to what we're going to discuss, and that has to do with, people's perceptions of Mexico and how that, when I say people's perception, I'm talking about U.S. voters' perceptions on Mexico, the Mexican government, the Mexican people, and how elites in the country could affect those perceptions, affect those attitudes, right? And whether or not, how powerful are elites in controlling the narrative for people's views. And why do we care about people's views? Because we are a democracy, and we vote in leaders based upon their promises and their rhetoric, and then they go out into the world and make, treaties and have other types of interactions with foreign leaders. And so it becomes very important that we understand why voters vote the way they do.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I guess, like you said, it directly affects us. And so, since you're studying this, are there already studies on that, on the perception? So do you already have an idea of what the perception is, or are you going in there blind?
Oh, no. There's a lot of studies about what's referred to as elite cues and how, political elites, i.e. politicians, basically can use certain amount of rhetorical statements in order to affect someone's opinion. Okay, and again, these studies have demonstrated over and over again, this goes all the way back down to the 50s onward, right? It's like, folks, voters, they're people, right? And they've got families, they've got jobs, they want to relax, such. So are they really going to go out and scrutinize and try to really figure out and collect all the data and read all the newspapers and look at everyone's point of view in order to make a decision? In other words, are they really going to do this hardcore homework before they go to the ballot box? Yeah. And the answer is no.
Yeah, definitely
right.
Not.
They're definitely not going to do that. So they rely on cues. I mean, people throw out certain statements, and do these statements then reflect back on their own personal worldviews? Or are how well do these statements then reflect back on their values and their already pre-existing attitudes? And of course, whatever the context. Like, for example, if you're in a part of the country that's suffering economically, and someone's telling you, hey, this free trade agreement is going to cost you jobs. then what are you going to say? I mean, as soon as you hear that, you're going to be saying, no, I'm not into that, kind of a thing. And so that's the study. So for the particular study that we're working on and we're still looking for it to get published, what we did was we gave two different rhetorical statements, tiny little paragraphs, right, about fighting corruption in Mexico, to see whether or not people's views on Mexico would change depending upon these two different statements, right? And so what we saw was one statement, right, had all of these made-up facts and figures about defeating corruption in Mexico, but it was spun as a positive thing, that Mexico is winning. We actually use this term, winning the fight against corruption. Mm. Then we use those exact same figures, those exact same numbers, right? Those exact same, statements, but this time spun it that Mexico was losing, right? And if I were to show it to you, you would see that the amount of words that change in both the paragraphs were very small. It was all about changing the word winning to losing, kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And there was a dramatic change in people's attitudes. Especially, we also had a control group in which no one read anything. They read some story about some Roman boat that was found out off the coast of Israel or something like that. I mean, it was had nothing to do with U.S.-Mexico relationships. And we discovered that there was a dramatic change in people's views about Mexico and their reliance on and their willingness to want to participate in collaborative actions with Mexico based upon this, upon just coming up with one story that says Mexico is doing a great job against corruption versus another one saying no.
Man, that's crazy. So the media does really have a power over people's perceptions and how they're going to vote, I guess.
Well, and the media, but also the media in again, that's part of the political elite, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not only just the media, which you're absolutely correct, but what we were focusing on mainly was the politicians, right?
Oh, okay. So their own personal statements that they put out.
Yeah. So the a politician will say stuff, and then that branch or that sector of the media will echo what's going on with that particular politician. So that you have the right-wing podcasts and radio and TV and streaming and all that, and you have the left-wing, right? And so they'll be basically, echoing, all of this, this stuff, amongst each other.
Yeah, so it turns one little statement into a big, statement or a big hoopla, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. And one thing about, especially when it comes to U.S.-Mexico relationships, that especially since the Trump administration, that there's these echo chambers, right, in which they're basically people are isolating themselves, self-selecting themselves into these different media outlets, right, and they'll only want to listen to what is it that kind of confirms what they already believe in. And then what happens then is you have greater radicalization, right? So already let's start off with someone who's like, I don't know about, what's going on in the world, so I'm going to tap into this. And all of a sudden they start hearing things, and then all of those statements start getting ramped up and start ramping up until finally, before the end of the day, the person listening is pretty far out there in one direction or the other, right or left.
Correct. And then these days it's even more tricky with like Twitter and Facebook because they have algorithms. As soon as you start looking at certain things online, then they're gonna put out more they want to push you towards that. They'll like give you feedback and what you want to see.
Exactly. And then of course, if the algorithm doesn't work, then you get the full fight, the full Twitter fight, the full Facebook fight.
Yeah.
Or what I've been discovering lately is the social platform Nextdoor, which is about neighbors kind of exchanging ideas. There's one here in El Paso as well, in different neighborhoods in El Paso. And boy, talk about, there is no algorithm on that one because what your neighbors are. You select your neighborhood, right?
Correct.
And so someone will put up a statement, most of the time is, I lost my dog, or I lost my cat, or
Yeah.
or here's a cool picture of a deer that started hanging out in my front yard or something like that, right? But then every once in a while, someone will put out something, and then the exchange that comes out as a result of that is pretty interesting. I like just to watch, just to read it, just to, as a social scientist, just to see what people's views are.
Yeah, why it goes all over the place, or it gets pretty heated.
Yeah, it gets pretty heated, and of course, it's all based upon opinions, and it's all based upon not really facts. It's about someone throwing out an accusation, like, oh, that outlet is such and such, is the mouthpiece of whatever, right? So it's just like a whole bunch of just accusations without any data or any proof to back it up, which going back to our experiment that I described, is it goes hand in hand. It's like the facts, figures, data doesn't really match up with people's how they approach making political decisions. A lot of it is just emotion, fear, for the most part.
Yeah, and then I'm sure politicians feed into that to try to get more voters to vote for them.
Oh yeah, there's definitely a feeding frenzy that happens.
Oh, yeah, especially with the election coming up soon. It's gonna get even more crazier next year.
Yeah.
And then so back to just Mexico and I guess United States relations. So I guess that's just a broad question. What exactly is the relationship at the moment?
Well, officially, the U.S. and Mexico, along with Canada, has a trade agreement. It used to be called NAFTA. Now it's called the U.S. Canada Mexico agreement.
Okay.
And it's pretty interesting how that changed, right? So it went from North American Free Trade Agreement, right? So let's focus on the identity part, right? Which is North America. It's like we're all one people, North
Correct.
America. And then the other part is Free Trade Agreement. So basically we're talking about trade. We're talking about opening up trade. We're talking about making borders more porous, etc. Now you're going to the U.S., Canada, Mexico agreement. So now
they're separate again.
So now there's no longer a single regional identity. It's now 3 different countries coming together for an agreement.
And does that mean in a way like Mexico and Canada are gaining more power? Because before it seemed that America had more, I guess, power in this situation, but now it seems...
No, I would disagree with that. First of all, the USMCA is basically the same as NAFTA.
Oh, okay.
They added in e-commerce. They merged what was referred to as the 2-side agreements on the environment and labor into the agreement. So now instead of having 3 different agreements, it's now 1 agreement. So there was a little bit of change here and there, but these changes were really minor. It was more of an update.
Oh, okay.
And also one of the biggest things that were added to the USMCA is the sunset clause.
The sunset clause?
Yeah, which means that unlike NAFTA, there is an expiration date, which means then that when you're getting closer to that expiration date, you have to, according to the agreement, start renegotiating it.
Okay.
And it can come up with many different scenarios. One scenario would be, we like it the way it is, just stays the way it is. Another way would be, I don't like this, this, and this. I want to renegotiate this, right? And then the worst scenario, as far as the agreement is concerned, would be, we don't want to renegotiate this. The whole thing dies. There's no longer an agreement between the 3 countries.
Correct. But you don't see that in the future, or do you?
No, I do not see that in the future because business, especially here in the state of Texas, right? Texas is the Texas, what you would consider the state domestic product. You have the gross domestic, the GDP, the gross domestic product, which is basically everything, all the value that's created in the country. Well, each state has their own, right? Chunk of that, right? And so the state's domestic product, or the gross state product, right, of Texas strongly depends on trade and economic relationships with Mexico. Strongly does so. And so every time during the Trump administration, when they kept on wanting to renegotiate NAFTA, building walls and such, the Washington D.C. got a big pushback from Republican business people in Texas saying, "Wait a second,
You're hurting our business. This is one of the main things."
Exactly." And so I do, and then of course you have other states too. Michigan, surprisingly, even though it's as far out because of the auto industry, as well as California, right? Surprisingly, New Mexico, not so much. Even though it's so close, but industrial development in New Mexico is not that great. It's not that large, and so it has a very small economic relationship with Mexico. But Texas, Arizona, California, and other states like Michigan, Ohio, big manufacturing states, right? That kind of like exchange parts. They sell each other parts. Are really dependent upon getting tariff-free access to Mexico. So anyway, to quickly answer your question, no, I do not see a future in which the agreement dies. There would have to be a major groundswelling of citizen demand to end relationship, which I just do not see happening. I just can't envision the level of dissatisfaction among the U.S. citizens that would outbalance business interests in order to stop, that free trade agreement from continuing.
And these agreements, they totally changed El Paso's economy and just the way El Paso and Juarez work, correct?
Oh, absolutely. El Paso before NAFTA, so we're talking about before 1994, was a major manufacturing in the area of textiles, right? In which clothing manufacturing and things of that nature was pretty strong here. And then with NAFTA, all of that just disappeared. It all went south, whether it was directly to Juarez or further south into Mexico, but it was due to the price differences in wages, right? So you can get the same garments, the same blue jeans, sewn up in Mexico cheaper than you could do it here in El Paso. So.
Yeah, so obviously that changed, and that the manufacturing economy here in El Paso changed. It seemed like it went into like the telemarketing. Is that correct? Or
yeah, so just like many other places in developed countries, in countries that are wealthy, whether you're talking about European or Canadian or U.S., Japanese, what you're seeing is a shift away from manufacturing into service sectors, and we sometimes think of service sectors as McDonald's or something like that. But I mean, yeah, that is the service sector to a certain degree. But we're talking about, like, for example, the virtual office, the telemarketing, every time you call up because your oven doesn't work or you're having problems with your AT&T service or whatever, you're calling up somebody, right? Yeah. And so that's being spread out. And what El Paso has to its advantage is a whole bunch of people that can speak Spanish. Right.
Yeah.
And so with the Hispanic Latinx community growing in the United States, in which a large segment of them are still dependent upon Spanish as their primary language, we have here a giant reservoir of people that can speak Spanish, and not only just Spanish, but the Spanish that people in the rest of the United States can speak, right? So, there's different degrees of Spanish, just like there's different degrees of English, right? And so you can, better, so we have that in a sense, what's referred to as competitive advantage in that. And so there's a lot of these service centers opening up. Now, the big deal, though, is, are these folks getting paid what they're worth? And that becomes the trick, right? A lot of manufacturing jobs in the United States, for the longest time, like look at the auto industry, those are union jobs in which people were making, you can go from high school to the assembly line and be middle income. And I can't do that anymore, right? And so the question here is, as people are moving into these service sector jobs, which I think are highly skilled, right? Just think about the patience, the psychology, the training you need to deal with when you get this angry customer.
Oh yeah, man, I tried doing one of those call center jobs. It kind of last 2 weeks, man.
Yeah, that's a pretty skill. I mean, you got to be really good, to know how to handle people. You got to have your own center. You gotta know what you're doing, right? And you should be compensated for that. I
Yeah,
mean,
definitely.
you got someone that's doing that. Yeah, heck yeah, they deserve it. And, middle income, middle class, income. Type of thing, the so-called American dream, in which you can provide a salary base, so that way your kids have resources
Yeah,
to do better than you did, but that's not been happening, in which incomes are not rising as fast. As a matter of fact, if you look at all data, you'll see that even though Americans have become more productive, in other words, they're creating more value for the U.S. economy, their share of that has been dropping. And so it was in which, again, this is a podcast, so I'm using my fingers to demonstrate. But if you think about two lines, right? So you have productivity growing, and then think of another line, meaning your wages, your income. And it was growing in parallel. And then in the 1980s, something happened in which all of a sudden the productivity continued, so still upward climb, but the line that measured your income starts flattening out and it starts increasing, but at a very small level. And so therefore you have this giant gap between productivity and wages.
and what was the reason for that change? Was it just like corporations got more greedy, or was it just unionization stopped, or?
Yeah, there was a lot of laws passed in the 1980s that made it more and more difficult for workers to unionize. And you had these new laws, especially in the American Southeast, including Texas, called or it's still called right to work states, which is a little bit of a misnomer, in which basically makes it very difficult for unions to to organize labor. And so therefore there is no more collective bargaining. So everyone's got to bargain their salary independent of each other and start. So instead of, coming in with one voice and say, we want, $30 an hour, right? Now it's everyone trying to outcompete each other, right? In which, oh, that guy wants 30, I'll take 28. Oh, that guy wants 28, I'll take 27. That guy wants 27, I'll take 25. And so it's basically goes down.
Yeah.
And then also, a lot of regulations were changed in the 1980s. And to make it so that way companies can start, moving around more around the world. And so therefore workers would basically have to be competing with global, type wages, which then would drive wages further down. And so there were a lot of changes that started in the 1980s, in which the United States really started, at the forefront of this economic ideology called neoliberalism, right? In which the United States adopted and then, how would you say, exported around the world, right? And this is based upon this notion that markets are the best way to determine everything, and we just need to rely more and more on markets and not on policies, and so therefore policies need to step aside.
Man, that's so it's just all about trying to gain as much money as possible, I guess, for these companies.
Yeah, and so in the United States, as a result, starting from the 1980s, you see a giant, concentration of wealth, in which, ever since the 90s, the top 1%, top 10%, type of, concept starts popping up.
Okay. But can you actually, like, when you analyze in terms of wealth and where it's distributed, can you actually see like a difference between, like, I guess the bottom percentage of Americans and then the super wealthy? Like, is there a growing gap?
Oh yeah, absolutely. There's a major income gap between, in which the top 10% is gathering more and more wealth, and if you think about if you think metaphorically like a pie, right, in which there's like 100 people in the room, right, and then you can think about it in equal terms, that pie gets separated 100 to exactly 100 equal slices. Well, as time has gone on, what you'll see is like 10 out of those 100 are getting a larger slice out of that pie, and the other 90 people in the room are getting fewer and fewer. In other words, their slices are becoming thinner and thinner and thinner. So if you think about that, if you carry that kind of like that mental model with you, right, it's a really good way of understanding, because a lot of people say, well, 80% of the wealth is in 10% of the people's hands. That it's like people get a little bit confused when you're talking that way. They don't quite understand. But if you use that example, that metaphor that I said about that pie and how, only 10 people in the room now are getting 25% of that pie, right? Is that fair? And then as time goes on, it just keeps that pie, that slice, that half, it becomes half of it, and then, 80% of it and such.
So what do we do as Americans? So, like, what can we do to kind of stop this growing gap from happening, or is there nothing we really can do?
Well, I think that there is, but it does require a lot of work. The average American has got to have to really participate more and more in politics, in their workplace, and these things are not easy. It's not easy. It's scary, right? I mean, look at the unionization that's going on in places like Starbucks and Amazon and such. That's kind of scary stuff, because here you are. This is your job. People don't take jobs, at least, not many people, just because, hey, I got nothing else to do, right? They take jobs because they need money. And all of a sudden now you're telling them, well, wait a second, if I do these types of activities, if I start talking up, if I start speaking up, does that mean I could lose my job? Well, the answer is yeah, you can. So it's scary. And so how is it that you're going to now convince a whole bunch of folks, hey, just, they can't fire everybody, right? But no one wants to be the first one getting fired.
Yeah, no one wants to be the scapegoat, because there is going to be a scapegoat.
Yeah, so everyone's like, basically, and in political science, we understand this is called the free rider problem, right? It's like, oh, you mean I'll let you do all the work to organize. I'll let you do all the work to make the world a better place. But because it's a public good, it's a collective good, right? You can't deny me from it. So I'll sit back and do nothing. You do all the work, and then I get all the benefits. So my cost-benefit analysis is I have zero cost. I get all the benefit. I do nothing. I don't speak up. But you guys over there in the other corner of the room, you do all the work, and then I'll just reap the benefits from it. And if everyone thinks that way,
then nothing's ever going to get done.
Everyone's ever going to get done. And so people have to really, and then again, but then as a political scientist, even though we come up with this nice logical little framework and understanding things, but we do discover something, and that is people do organize. People do go through collective action. People do get change, Like, for example, here in El Paso, shutting down Osarco because of the pollution, that was created, right? That cost a lot of jobs. Osarco was, employing a lot of people. And so with the regulations that was imposed, they had to shut it down because they could no longer smelt that copper because of all of the things. And justifiably, right? Who wants lead, in the soil and affecting people's brains development, especially young children and such, right? Yeah, but as a result of that, people lost their job, right? And so now the question here is, what is the trade-offs, right? So everyone's got to have to make certain types of trade-offs when it comes to that. And that's also another major issue. So this stuff is complicated. It is very, very complicated. There is no simple answer and to these things, but it does revolve around a values change, a perception change, a way of people trying to develop greater amount of trust with each other, develop communities, and even, in the darkest days of even in the brightest days, of the civil rights movement in the United States, there were these problems, right? Here, I mean, think about that when you're dealing with, Black Americans, right? Here you are, you could be dead for organizing, not just losing your job. You could be dead. You could be lynched. You could be put in prison, and whatever would happen to you there, you could have your life ruined for the rest of your life just to organize, right? But they did it. And so the costs there were very, very high. But Black Americans did it. And was it a smooth sail? No. Did every Black American participate? I don't think so. But enough did. And enough other allies joined in as well. And so and then you look at the Mexican American community in organizing, in the Mexican American community, same thing, right? Whether it be here, like for example, we're sitting here at UTEP. UTEP used to be a campus in which the vast majority of people on campus were not Latinx. They were white, right? And it took a large sea change to make it to the way it is now, in which now our campus reflects the community, 80% Hispanic, right? Just like the rest of El Paso. That wasn't always the case, and that required a lot of movement, a lot of change, a lot of change in attitudes. Right behind you, there's the Undergraduate Learning Center, which was as a result of a major lawsuit because UTEP was not getting enough state appropriations out of proportion with other institutions because we were becoming primarily Hispanic, right? And so they sued, and now we got a really cool building out there, right? And so things can change. I mean, but it does require, the mental and physical energy of people to make these changes happen. And people, again, I'm kind of repeating myself, but you got to have like a different mindset. If you think about it in just what's in it for me, well, then we're all doomed.
Yeah, so this individualistic mindset is kind of poisoning us in a way.
Yeah, I mean, it can produce some really strong barriers because for a lot of the changes that are necessary, you're going to need to have, collective action. Collective action, and individual, calculations don't work together well. They defeat each other. So you can't have one or the other. Either you're going to start partnering up and understand that someone else's problems is the same as your own, and you work together, or, hey, you got problems, I got my own problems. I'm, deal with my own problems, and you go deal with your problems, and best of luck to you.
Right. And we'll probably never resolve our problems because we're not helping.
Yeah.
And it just seems like you said, it's such a complex issue and difficult. Like, how do you change a culture? How do you change people's mindset?
Mm-hmm.
Especially now, like you said, everyone's so stuck in their own little media world, their own phone right now. So how would you go about to get people to look up and talk to each other?
Yeah, and this thing that's been happening in the United States that you just described, right? It just didn't come up when cell phones started happening. Robert Putnam is a political scientist. He discovered that we as a country, right, all walks of life, have been isolating each other, starting from the 1960s onward. People don't participate in clubs like they used to. They don't participate in civic organizations like they used to. There is no real, how would you say, togetherness. People are all separated. And so we like to say, it's the cell phones, it's social media. But hey, this is just part of something that's been going on for quite some time now.
So the cell phone's just a symptom. It's not a cause. It's been...
Yeah.
So what is the cause? Like, why do you think that this started happening, this kind of individualistic mindset? I mean, I know that's always been kind of a part of America to be like the individual, I guess, but how did it go on steroids, I guess?
Well, there are a lot of factors you can look into, and I like to always mention to students studying political science that there's not going to be any one variable, any one thing that can explain it. Oftentimes, it's like a whole bunch of stuff happening at the same time, right? Again, going back to the 1980s, there was a new mindset that starts developing during the Reagan years, in which, a buy-in that the market system is the best system, like I was telling you, like the adoption of that neoliberal, thinking. And so a lot of people started believing it. They started believing that everyone can become wealthy, that everyone has that equal chance to become wealthy, that the opportunities are out there, right? And so there was this ideological shifting, away from what was happening during the counterculture in the 1960s and 70s, in which all of a sudden you start seeing in that counterculture a lot of people looking at, the level of drug use and violence and promiscuity didn't really fit into their values. And so they started shifting over in the opposite direction, right? In which, hey, I'm not into this, hippiedom, kind of stuff, and so I'm going to buy into this individualism, right? And then, as I mentioned, the laws were changing, so it became more and more difficult for people to do collective bargaining. So that broke unions, which was one of the major ways that people started, doing collective type stuff. During the 1970s, maybe perhaps some of your viewers can recall this. I remember myself as a kid living in Brooklyn, the level of violence in the United States really ramped up. The amount of crime really ramped up quite a bit. And so it was not very safe. It used to be, again, not to point the United States as being some sort of Ozzie and Harriet, ideal world, right? But there was a time in which kids could just go out, in which the dinner bell was, the lights starting going on, so you got to go home for dinner, kind of a thing, and the level of violence that starts spawning up in the late 60s and moving into the 1970s and even to the early 80s, right? It was just not safe. People didn't trust each other. You go out and who knows what was going to happen. And of course, this was even worse in places like Compton, in which then all of a sudden you start having these massive, drug and gang violence starts developing in the 1980s, right? It just starts becoming not safe to start, congregating. And everyone's like starting to throw in the deadbolts and, how many locks can I put on? And I got to start caging up my house with the iron, stuff, the iron railings, not the iron railings, but you know what I'm saying, those iron things on the windows, right? And, so there were a lot of factors going on in which people started thinking to themselves, it's just better just to stay by, to myself, or stay within my family and not really associate.
So I could see how that happens. All these factors just kind of start going together and it starts creating an avalanche effect, I guess.
Yeah. And then people grow up that way. And then you have a generation socialized that's the way it is. You can't trust each other. It's too much violence. You never know what that person over there, especially when you start moving into more individualism, right? Then all of a sudden people start taking advantage of each other, not because they're going to hurt each other, but, people are like looking out for themselves. And so you can't really trust each other. And all of a sudden everyone thinks, well, you can't really trust anybody, right? Which then means if you can't trust anyone, why would you want to start hanging out and form a social club with them or, go hang out, So it starts, and then it turns out, ironically, that the people that do hang out are like organized, criminals.
Right? They're like, well, if you guys ain't going to do anything, we'll get together. And
yeah. And so you do see, that kind of fragmentation and reintegration, so to speak, in these types of communities that start developing. Yeah, I know, right? But I mean, like I said, it's just not one thing. You can't. I mean, it would be pretty cool. It would make my life as a political scientist easy, right? But I can just say, okay, just this one thing was the problem. You correct this one thing, we're good, and that's not reality.
Right, it's just a bunch of things that we're gonna have to work on and fix.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then I guess back to just our city in general. I know we're pretty poor, like, in terms of our GDP, like, are we still considered one of the poorest cities in America, or?
Yeah, well, considering our size, right, of the city and how educated we are, a lot of people don't know this, but if you use as a benchmark people that had some college education, we are the second most educated city in Texas. Number one being Austin, and then number two being El Paso. And if you then you count only people that finish college, then we're no longer the second, right? I think we're like not the fourth or the fifth, right? But when you say some college, it's difficult to know because that's just like, it could be anything from like, I took a year in community college to, I spent 4 or 5 years at UTEP, but I never finished. So there's a huge amount of stuff going on in that definition of some college, right? And so, but we are highly educated. I think one of the major issues is a branding issue. Juarez and the violence that occurred in Juarez in the early part of the 21st century, people have this visceral problem with El Paso. They think of El Paso, when I say, do you know that El Paso, like, for example, when people come looking for work here at UTEP, right? I got to tell them, it's like, hey, did you know that El Paso is like on the FBI rankings, either the first, second, or third safest city in the United States? And they're like, what? And I say, and it's like, but you got all that violence in Juarez, but it stops at the border. It doesn't come here. We're very safe, and this is a great place to raise a family. It's very safe. I don't have a problem, with my daughter going out. I'm always concerned. I'm a dad, right? But would I have the same level of concern? Let's say if I was living in LA or New York? No, not even close, right? So we're very, very safe, and it's clean. We got a lot of things going on here, but we have this branding issue. Most of the country, if not the world, thinks of us as some sort of backwater city.
Okay. And then when the violence started happening in Juarez, did businesses start moving out, or?
Well, actually, I wrote a paper on this, right? So as the violence, myself and a master's student here at UTEP, we wrote a paper together on this. It was actually part of her master's thesis, right? In which we actually studied how the violence in Juarez, right, as well as all other border cities in Texas, we just looked at Texas, we didn't look at any other border cities, right? And we discovered that the level of violence as they increased on our sister cities on the Mexican side increased. That the economic prosperity on the northern side, on the Texas side, increased. In other words, a lot of people were escaping, the problems that they were having in let's say Juarez, right, or Nogales, whatever, right, and then they, Laredo, that they, started moving north. And one thing about the United States is, if you're poor, you can't immigrate, but if you got cash, you're welcome. And so you start seeing a lot of people, wealthy people from these areas, moving their businesses. And of course, you can move it deeper into Texas or the rest of the United States, or you could just move it a couple of miles, basically the same clientele, right? Or the same type of clientele. And so you start seeing a lot. And then, of course, if you're wealthy enough, right, that you can cross the border and just stay here in Texas, stay here in El Paso and buy stuff. And so a lot of middle-class people in Juarez, it was too dangerous for them to go buy stuff at something like equivalent to a Target. You buy, things like that. So you just come here where you can shop, you can do stuff, and the level of random violence, which was happening, in 2008 in Juarez, was out of control. And so therefore, you start seeing a lot of people coming over, buying stuff. So our city, as well as the other cities on the U.S. side, on the Texas side, were making strong advances economically while the violence was increasing. And that's because of, the fact that violence, the answer to that was that violence was not spilling over. Because if the violence was spilling over, it's like, why bother going to El Paso if the same situation that's in El Paso is going to happen to be here in Juarez, right?
No, so they felt safe here and they were able to do their business.
Yeah. And again, this goes to the power that if you got cash, you can be mobile. And of course, if you're not, then you got to stay where you're at. And that's one of the problems with neoliberalism, is that it does benefit those that have, the ability to move, right? Because the laws, the regulations are such. You can get a permanent status in the United States very easy if you throw down, a few million in investment. That green card comes very quick. Whereas if you're poor, okay, here's the lottery, good, best of luck.
Let's hope you're one of the lucky ones that
Yeah,
get out.
yeah, yeah, kind of a thing. So that it was because of that upper to higher class mobility that really helped out the cities. Anyway, but the question you had was, so what I'm trying to tell you is that there's a lot of potential here in El Paso, right? But people just the branding is such that they have these misconceptions about El Paso, and until our city leaders can somehow, break that stereotype and try to campaign and try to bring in not just another call center, but something a little bit more to the city, we're not going to prosper. I really think that given our level of education, which is kind of like what's referred to as human capital or skill levels, right? I don't think we're getting the compensation that we should be getting and the amount of wealth that we should be getting as a result, because the jobs aren't here. And so if you, for example, if you get an engineering job here at UTEP or get an engineering degree here at UTEP, you have to ask yourself, well, what are the prospects here in El Paso versus somewhere else? And if you're saying to yourself, I love El Paso, I have family here, I want to stay here, then the trade-off is I'm going to have to probably take a lower income job, maybe not even the one that I studied for. Whereas if you're saying to yourself, no, I want to get paid for what I do, then you're going to have to leave. So the question here is, how is it we can create an employment structure in El Paso so that way people don't have to make that choice? You get a degree at NYU, right? How many people are saying, "Oh, I got to leave New York City"?
Yeah.
They're gonna say, "No, I got prospects here, right? So I don't have to leave, right? And if I go anywhere else, I'll probably get an income cut. So the only way I would want to leave New York City is I just don't like New York City for whatever reason, right? And then there's that trade-off. Yeah, I'll go somewhere else where I'll get a income cut, but it's because I don't like here, right? So, question here again, I guess the bottom line is how do you develop a economic structure to keep the talent here in El Paso, and for those folks that wanted to stay here, to reward them for what they know, reward them, give them the wages based upon their skill set.
And you think that's mostly to do with city council, like pushing towards getting those type of jobs here, or who would be the ones that would help bring that kind of system?
Well, yeah, city government and county government, I guess, but primarily city government. They just gotta, there's got to be a long range plan and a branding one. They've had some branding, type of campaigns in the past. I've always kind of scratched my head as to, is that really going to bring people in, kind of a thing. So it's just a matter of playing it smart, trying to figure it out. And yeah, but don't get me wrong. I'm not being hypercritical here, right? Because El Paso's changed quite a bit. I moved to El Paso in 2005, and El Paso's way different now. It's a lot better now than it was in 2005. And it's a lot of small steps. And so the question here is, do you just want to continue the small steps and just hope that maybe in 50 years things are going to be great? Or are you going to just do that major push, this concept of a tipping point? Can we get to that tipping point in which you get to the point in which then everything starts moving forward at a rapid pace? And so that would be my suggestion would be, let's get to that tipping point, as opposed to just these tiny little steps, which we've been doing a pretty good job on, right? And, okay, we got another call center, another 100 jobs, fantastic. But, that's a small step, right? So let's see how we can do bigger steps.
Try to get something, like you said, like jobs aren't just a call center, like maybe an engineering firm or something more prestige a little.
Yeah, and of course, this is outside of my, this is where you have to go talk to my my colleagues in public administration here in the department that, they know more about this. I just study comparative and international relations, right? So, like for example, we're supposed to talk about more about U.S.-Mexico politics. we're talking more about local politics or local issues now, but which is fine. I have no problem with that because I think, especially given our proximity, that's intertwined, right? You can't to not talk about the effect here regarding U.S.-Mexico relationships is kind of silly, right? Because we get impacted dramatically. Like for example, talking about NAFTA and the movement of manufacturing jobs out of El Paso as a result of NAFTA back in '94. So,
and well, back to that NAFTA issue. Like, I know that there was I guess we lost all those jobs in the manufacturing community. Did anything happen like that in the recent agreement?
No, because like I said, there was no real change. I mean, there wasn't really any major change. Other than what I just talked about in the earlier part of our conversation. They did increase also the amount of North American content to cars in order to make it officially a North American car and therefore be tariff-free. But again, all of these changes are tiny. So, what the rhetoric from the Trump administration was that we were going to change the agreement so that way all of those manufacturing jobs would come back to the United States. And the agreement did not change in any way that was going to make that happen. It was just not going to happen. Because again, it's the United States and our skill levels are such that we should not be doing manufacturing. We should be doing more service sector type things. Again, I'm not talking about McDonald's. I'm talking about the service sector would be, for example, an engineer, right? What does an engineer actually, manufacture something? No, that engineer puts an idea together, creates a plan of action, makes something, that's very complicated into something that's very real for people to do, right? Whether that be to create a new building, a new bridge, to create even, for example, a manufacturing plant or things of that nature, right? That's a service. I mean, they're providing a service. Just like, for example, myself as an educator or as a researcher here at UTEP, I'm providing a service, right? Do I create anything tangible? Do you actually, at the end of the day, do you see like a widget or something I put together? No. But what I did do was I gave knowledge and I helped people understand knowledge, right? I helped students. Not only I gave them knowledge, but I also was like, hey, this is how you take that knowledge and you can think it and rework it and develop greater ideas. So it's a service that I provide, right? So we got to really think about, these sorts of, high-end service type things for our country.
Awesome, man. Well, I don't want to take too much time. We've been talking for a while, and this is such an interesting topic, and I'd love to maybe come back again or talk to you again, because this is, like I said, it's such a broad topic, and there's so much we could discuss. But before I guess I leave you, is there anything you would like to specifically tell our audience that you think they should know in terms of getting involved in politics?
Just go out to your community, get involved in your community, and of course vote. One of the things about maybe your viewers don't know this, right? But when we don't have a general election, the amount of people voting for local politics is 10%. Think about that. 10% of the voting population of a city decides how the city is going to move forward. That's not right. And when we have a general election, it goes into maybe the 50s, right? So like half. So it's a lot better than 10%, right? Yeah. But people should just become more aware, become active citizens, more involved, and go out and vote. And of course, when you vote, make a do your homework. Think about things and see what the long-term projections of these people's ideas are. And really start supporting people that you believe in and that are strongly qualified to do their jobs.
Oh, yeah. And then I guess, like you said earlier, you don't get caught up in just the little, what did you call them? Like little snippets that politicians say.
Yeah, just like the nice little soundbite, that causes more fear and anxiety than promise.
Correct. Yeah, actually do your research and I guess people need to try to look at different sources and don't just rely on the one that's going to tell you the same thing over and over.
Yeah, like this podcast.
Right. Well, I'm trying to be a little more open, try to get more open ideas. I'm not trying to just be liberal or
Yeah.
or Republican.
No. I mean, my point is, it's like you listen to this one and then listen to something else, and think about things. Ask questions. Just don't just passively absorb things. Be critical. Oh, you're saying that this agreement is going to cost me jobs. Well, can you elaborate on that a little bit? Can you provide me more evidence on that, as opposed to like, yeah, and just nodding, yep.
Don't just be a yes man. Be logical and use your brain.
Yeah.
Hell yeah, man. Well, thank you, Gaspar. It's been a really good conversation and very eye-opening, and I hope people will get from this conversation. We'll try to actually get more involved in their politics, and it's pretty sad that only 10% are voting during the non-general elections.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, our local elections are really important. That decides directly like how
Exactly.
what's going to happen to us. So I think it's even more important than a general election.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. These guys that are in the city council or county government, they're going to be directly impacting you.
Oh yeah, man. So thank you, and
Thank you. I enjoyed the conversation.
oh, yeah. You have a good day.
You too. Bye.